The weight of the silver tray was a familiar ache in my wrist, a dull throb that had become the background music of my life. Around me, the gala swirled in a kaleidoscope of silk dresses and tailored tuxedos, a world so far removed from my own that it felt like watching a foreign film without subtitles. My job was simple: keep a low profile, offer canapés with a polite, impersonal smile, and remain invisible. For a 23-year-old art history student drowning in debt, invisibility was a survival tactic. It was also, I was learning, profoundly lonely. My focus was a tight, narrow beam, concentrating on the balance of the tray and the path through the shifting clusters of guests. I navigated by sound: the clink of champagne flutes, the murmur of low-stakes conversation, the sharp, artificial bursts of laughter. Each step was a careful calculation, a small victory against the chaos. My black uniform, a size too large and smelling faintly of industrial starch, was my cloak of anonymity. I was a function, not a person. A pair of hands, a walking table. And then I saw him. Arthur Vance. He wasn't holding court or commanding attention. He stood near the French doors that led to the terrace, a still point in the turning world. He held a glass of what looked like whiskey, its amber depths catching the light of the chandeliers. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with silver threading his dark hair at the temples. His face was all quiet lines and thoughtful angles, and he wore his wealth not like a costume, but like a second skin he was entirely comfortable in. I knew of him, of course. Everyone in this city did. He was a patron of the arts, a quiet philanthropist, the name on the side of the very museum we were standing in. I had seen him before, at other events I'd worked, and each time my gaze would snag on him. It was the way he listened, truly listened, when someone spoke to him, his head tilted slightly, his eyes focused. It was the way his presence seemed to create a small pocket of calm around him. While others preened and postured, he simply existed, grounded and sure. I found myself tracing the line of his jaw from across the room, imagining the texture of his suit, wondering what his low, measured voice would sound like if it were directed at me. It was a foolish, private little fantasy, a harmless distraction from the ache in my feet and the emptiness in my bank account. A surge in the crowd, propelled by a particularly loud laugh from the center of the room, sent a ripple effect outward. A man in a garish bow tie, already 2 glasses too deep, stumbled backward without looking. He collided with my side, a soft, fleshy impact that was just enough to shatter my concentration. My wrist, already protesting, gave a final, sharp complaint. Time seemed to slow down, stretching into a syrupy, horrifying crawl. I saw the tray tilt, a slow-motion disaster. The delicate porcelain bowls of shrimp cocktail and miniature quiches began their graceful, doomed slide. I tried to correct, a desperate lurch that only made it worse. The clatter of ceramic on the polished marble floor was like a gunshot in the sudden lull of conversation. The splash of cocktail sauce felt like a mortal wound. A collective gasp, then a wave of murmuring. Faces turned, no longer indifferent, but now painted with expressions ranging from pity to annoyance. My invisibility cloak had been ripped away, leaving me exposed under the glare of 1,000 judgmental lights. My face burned, a hot, prickling wave of shame that started at my collar and flooded up to my hairline. I dropped to my knees, my only instinct to contain the damage, to gather the evidence of my failure. My hands shook as I reached for a broken piece of porcelain, the sharp edge a reflection of the jagged panic in my chest. "Leave it," the voice was low, calm, and directly above me. It cut through the buzz of the crowd and the frantic hammering of my own heart. I froze, my hand hovering over a smeared shrimp. I looked up, and my breath caught. It was him, Arthur Vance. He was looking down at me, and his expression held none of the disdain I expected. There was only a quiet, focused concern. He knelt, a fluid movement that seemed effortless in his expensive suit, bringing him down to my level. The noise of the gala receded, becoming a distant hum. All I could see was his face, the fine lines around his eyes, the startling clarity of his gaze. He wasn't looking at the mess. He was looking at me. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a quiet rumble that vibrated through the floor. I shook my head, unable to find my own voice. Words felt like an impossible currency I couldn't afford. "It's just a tray," he said softly, as if confiding a secret. He reached out, not for the debris, but for my hand, which was still trembling. His fingers were warm and dry, his grip firm but gentle. He gently turned my hand over, inspecting my palm as if looking for cuts. There were none, but the simple, unexpected touch sent a jolt through my system. From somewhere behind him, I heard the brisk, angry footsteps of my supervisor. I braced for the inevitable tirade, the public dismissal, the final, crushing humiliation of the night. Arthur didn't even turn around. He simply held up his other hand, a quiet gesture that stopped my supervisor in his tracks. Then he looked back at me, his eyes holding mine. A ghost of a smile touched the corners of his mouth, a small, private thing. He leaned in a little closer, his voice dropping so only I could hear it over the returning din of the party. "You seem to be carrying far too much tonight." His gaze was steady, and it felt like he was seeing right through the uniform, past the shame, and into the bone-deep weariness I lived with every day. He rose to his feet, pulling me up with him in one smooth, supportive motion. His hand lingered at the small of my back, a solid, grounding presence. And then he said the words, his voice a low, warm murmur against my ear. "Let me carry you instead." My mind went completely blank. The world tilted on its axis. It wasn't a proposition, not in the crude way I might have feared. The tone was wrong for that. It was something else entirely, a strange, poetic offer of rescue that made no logical sense, and yet felt like the most profound thing anyone had ever said to me. His hand was still at my waist, a steady point of warmth against the cheap fabric of my shirt. I could feel the solid strength of him, a quiet foundation in the shifting chaos of the room. He addressed my supervisor, his voice regaining its public, confident tone, though it never lost its essential gentleness. "Everything is fine. The young man is with me. I'll take care of the damages." He said it with such finality, such calm authority, that my supervisor could only nod, his face a mask of baffled deference. Arthur guided me away from the scene of the accident, his hand a constant, reassuring pressure. He led me through the crowd, which parted for him as if he were Moses and they were the Red Sea. We moved past the bar, through a set of double doors, and into a quiet, blessedly empty hallway. The air here was cooler, the sound of the party muffled and distant. He finally released me, though he didn't step too far away. He leaned against the wall, crossing his arms, and studied me for a long moment. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, but his gaze wasn't clinical. It was curious and kind. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ethan," I managed to say, my voice raspy. "Ethan," he repeated, tasting the name. "I'm Arthur Vance," as if I didn't know. As if his face wasn't on the cover of magazines in the checkout aisle where I bought my ramen noodles. "I know," I said, and then flushed, feeling foolish. "I mean, thank you. You didn't have to do that, someone had to," he said simply. "You looked like you were about to be executed for dropping a piece of fish." A small smile played on his lips again. It transformed his face, softening the severe lines and making him look younger, more approachable. I couldn't help but smile back, a weak, shaky thing. It felt like it. My hands were still trembling, so I shoved them into my pockets. "It's a ridiculous job," he said, not unkindly. "Carrying trays of food through a sea of people who aren't paying attention." He pushed off the wall and took a step closer. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim, elegant wallet, and from it, a business card. It was thick, creamy cardstock, with his name and a single phone number embossed in simple, black font. He also took out a pen. He turned the card over and wrote something on the back. He held it out to me. "I have a project," he said, his tone shifting to something more businesslike, yet still gentle. "I'm cataloging my late wife's collection of botanical illustrations. It's a large undertaking, and my own organizational skills are lacking. The work requires a careful hand and a good eye. I suspect you have both." I stared at the card, then back at his face, utterly bewildered. I don't understand." "It pays well," he continued, as if that were the only obstacle. "Better than this, I assure you. And you won't have to dodge drunk men in bad bow ties." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "Call the number on the front tomorrow. We can discuss the details. The address I've written on the back is for my estate. Come at 10-inch." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an invitation that felt like a quiet, unshakable certainty. I took the card. The texture was smooth and solid in my trembling hand. It felt like a lifeline. "Why?" I asked, the word escaping before I could stop it. Why me? Arthur held my gaze for a long, unblinking moment. The air in the hallway felt thick, charged with unspoken things. Because, he said slowly, his voice dropping to that low, intimate register again. For a moment back there, you were the only real person in that entire room. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and then he turned and walked back through the doors, disappearing into the party as seamlessly as he had appeared. I was left alone in the quiet hallway, the muffled sounds of the gala on one side, and the heavy silence of my own shock on the other. I looked down at the card in my hand. It was the most solid thing in my world. The next morning, I stood before a set of imposing iron gates, clutching the business card like a talisman. The address had led me miles out of the city, to a part of the county where houses had names instead of numbers. Arthur Vance's estate, Greywood, was less a house and more a small kingdom, hidden behind a tall, ivy-covered stone wall. I nearly lost my nerve. This was a world I had no place in, a language I didn't speak. But the memory of his calm voice and the sting of last night's humiliation propelled me forward. I pressed the button on the intercom. A voice, disembodied and crisp, asked my name. I gave it, and after a moment's pause, the gates swung open with a silent, hydraulic sigh. The gravel driveway crunched under the worn tires of my beat-up sedan as I drove slowly toward the main house. It wasn't a modern glass monstrosity, but an old stone manor, solid and timeless, nestled among ancient oak trees. It looked like it had grown out of the earth itself. Arthur was waiting for me on the front steps. He wasn't wearing a suit, but a simple pair of gray trousers and a soft, navy blue cashmere sweater. He looked more relaxed, more real, than he had at the gala. He watched me park and get out of my car, his expression unreadable. I felt a fresh wave of self-consciousness, acutely aware of my worn jeans and the nervous way I was clutching my backpack. "Ethan," he said, his voice a warm welcome that settled some of my anxiety. "I'm glad you came. I wasn't sure if you were serious," I admitted, walking toward him. "I am always serious," he replied, but the corner of his mouth ticked up, robbing the words of any severity. "Especially about things that matter." He gestured toward the open front door. "Come in. I'll show you the collection." The inside of the house was as breathtaking as the outside. It wasn't opulent or gaudy. It was filled with books, art, and comfortable-looking furniture. It felt like a home, not a museum. The air smelled of lemon oil, old paper, and something else. Something warm and clean, which I soon realized was the scent that clung to Arthur himself. He led me through a series of quiet, sun-drenched rooms to a large library at the back of the house. The library was my undoing. Two-story walls were lined floor to ceiling with books. A rolling ladder was tucked into a corner. In the center of the room, several large, flat-file cabinets stood next to a massive oak table. Sunlight streamed through a set of tall, arched windows that overlooked a sprawling garden. It was the most beautiful room I had ever seen. "This was Eleanor's," Arthur said softly, his gaze sweeping the room with a look of fond melancholy. "Her passion. She was a botanical artist. She collected these illustrations over a lifetime." He walked over to one of the cabinets and pulled open a wide, shallow drawer. He beckoned me over. Inside, resting on archival paper, was a stunningly detailed watercolor of a passion flower. The colors were vibrant, the lines impossibly fine. It was exquisite. "She collected hundreds," he explained, his voice low, "from the 17th century to the 20th. My project is to have them all properly identified, cataloged, and digitized. It's overdue." There was a weight to his words, a sense of a long-held duty he was finally ready to face. He explained the task. It was meticulous, detail-oriented work. I would be responsible for handling the illustrations, researching their origins if they were unlabeled, entering the data into a specialized software, and preparing them for a high-resolution scanner. It was the kind of work I dreamed of, the kind of work my art history degree was actually for. "The pay is $5,000 for the project," he said, naming a sum that made my head spin. "I estimate it will take you about a month of steady work, but you can set your own hours. I'll provide whatever supplies you need." He paused, his eyes finding mine. "Is that agreeable?" Agreeable? It was a rescue. It was a miracle. It was the answer to prayers I hadn't even known how to form. "Yes," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "That's more than agreeable. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said with a wry smile. You haven't seen my handwriting on the old inventory logs. And so began my strange new life at Greywood. For the next week, I drove out to the estate every morning, the journey becoming a ritual of transition from my cramped, noisy apartment to the quiet sanctuary of Arthur's library. He was a constant but unobtrusive presence. He would bring me a cup of tea in the morning and another in the afternoon, setting it down on a coaster on the edge of the large table without a word, a silent, comforting ritual. I spent hours in that room, losing myself in the delicate beauty of the illustrations. I learned the difference between a stipple engraving and an aquatint, between the work of Pierre-Joseph Redoute and Maria Sibylla Marion. The world outside the library walls, the rent I couldn't pay, the classes I was struggling to focus on, the gnawing loneliness, began to fade into the background. I watched Arthur when he wasn't looking. I observed the way he moved through his house, with a quiet economy of motion. He was a man accustomed to his own space, his own silence. Sometimes he would sit in one of the leather armchairs by the fireplace, reading a book for hours at a time. The only sounds would be the turning of his pages, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, and the soft scratch of my pen on the cataloging forms. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, companionable. It was a shared space that didn't need to be filled with idle chatter. But in that silence, my awareness of him grew into a low, steady hum. I became attuned to the small details. The way he would push his reading glasses up onto his forehead when he was thinking, the faint, clean scent of his soap, the way the light from the window would catch the silver in his hair. I found myself analyzing his every small action, trying to decipher a meaning that probably wasn't there. When he brought me tea, did his fingers brush mine by accident, or was it a deliberate, fleeting touch? When he smiled at something I said, was it simple politeness, or was there a genuine warmth in his eyes? I was terrified of misreading the situation, of mistaking kindness for interest, of letting my own foolish hopes color my perception. The power imbalance was a chasm between us. He was my employer, a wealthy man decades my senior. I was a broke student, utterly dependent on his generosity. To imagine anything more was dangerous and stupid. And yet, one afternoon, I was struggling to reach a book on one of the highest shelves, even with the rolling ladder. I was stretched out, my fingers just brushing the spine of the book, when I felt a solid presence behind me. "Allow me," Arthur's voice said, low and close to my ear. I hadn't even heard him approach. I froze, my body rigid. He reached up, his arm brushing against my shoulder, his body pressing lightly against my back. He was so close I could feel the warmth radiating from his chest. He easily plucked the book from the shelf. The entire interaction lasted no more than 5 seconds, but my heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. He stepped back, creating a respectable distance between us once more. "Here you are," he said, handing me the book. His expression was perfectly neutral. "Thanks," I mumbled, my face hot. I quickly climbed down the ladder, my legs feeling unsteady. He didn't mention the closeness. He didn't apologize or make a joke. He simply acted as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And maybe it was. Maybe I was the one investing these small moments with a significance they didn't possess. But the feeling of his body against mine, the brief, solid weight of him, lingered with me for the rest of the day. It was a brand of warmth I hadn't realized I was so cold without. The days settled into a rhythm, a quiet routine that felt more like home than my actual apartment ever had. I would arrive, Arthur would greet me with a nod and a quiet, "Good morning, Ethan," and I would lose myself in the work. We rarely spoke for long stretches, but the communication was constant in other ways. He learned I preferred my tea with milk and no sugar. I learned he took his coffee black. He noticed I was squinting at the finer details of the engravings and appeared the next day with a high-quality magnifying lamp placed on the table without comment. I noticed he had a slight limp on rainy days, a ghost of an old injury. These small, unspoken acts of observation and care began to build a bridge across the chasm of our differences. It was a bridge built of shared silence, mutual respect, and countless cups of tea. I started to relax in his presence, the constant fear of saying or doing the wrong thing slowly receding. I even found myself making him laugh once, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it did me. I had made a dry comment about a particularly pompous-looking orchid, and the sound of his genuine amusement was a reward I hadn't known I was seeking. One evening, I was packing up my bag, the sky outside already a deep, bruised purple. A storm had been threatening all day, and the first fat drops of rain were beginning to spatter against the library windows. "The roads will be treacherous," Arthur said, looking up from his book. He was silhouetted against the warm glow of a reading lamp, and for a moment, he looked like a figure from another time. "You shouldn't drive back to the city in this. I'll be fine," I said automatically, the lie tasting of practiced independence. "My car has character." A low rumble of thunder shook the house. Arthur raised an eyebrow. "It's not a request, Ethan. It's a statement of fact. You're staying for dinner. We have a guest room." The offer hung in the air. It was another one of his quiet certainties, delivered with an authority that was somehow not commanding, but caring. Part of me, the old, cautious part, screamed that this was a line being crossed. But a larger, quieter part of me was filled with a profound sense of relief. The thought of not having to drive an hour back to my cold, empty apartment was overwhelmingly appealing. "Okay," I said softly. "Thank you." He simply nodded, as if my acceptance were the only logical outcome. "Good." I was planning on opening a bottle of wine that is far too good to drink alone. Dinner was a simple affair: a roasted chicken, some vegetables from his garden, and the promised bottle of red wine. We ate in the kitchen, a warm, spacious room with a large wooden table. It felt domestic, intimate, and 1,000 miles away from the formal dining rooms of the gala. The storm raged outside, a wild and furious backdrop to the quiet peace within the house. The wine, or perhaps the unexpected intimacy of the situation, loosened my tongue. I found myself telling him about my studies, about my passion for the overlooked details of history, the stories hidden in the margins of paintings and manuscripts. He listened with that same focused intensity one had noticed at the gala, asking thoughtful questions, drawing me out. In turn, I learned a little about him. He spoke of his late wife, Eleanor, with a gentle, loving reverence that was devoid of self-pity. He talked about the gardens, about his work with the museum, about a trip he'd taken to see the northern lights. He was a man of quiet passions, of deep and abiding interests. "You know," he said, swirling the wine in his glass, his eyes fixed on the dark red liquid. "Eleanor would have adored you." My breath hitched. "Me?" "Yes," he said, looking up, his gaze direct and serious. "She had no patience for fools or flatterers. But she had an immense respect for quiet competence and genuine passion. She would have seen that in you immediately." The compliment landed with the force of a physical blow. It was so simple, so direct, and so deeply personal. It wasn't about my work, not really. It was about me. I felt a blush creep up my neck. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he said gently. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine for a brief, startling moment. His skin was warm, his touch firm. "I just wanted you to know." He withdrew his hand, but the warmth lingered, a phantom pressure on my skin. The moment stretched, filled with the sound of the rain and the frantic beating of my own heart. Later, he showed me to the guest room. It was a beautiful, serene space, with a large, comfortable-looking bed and a window that overlooked the rain-swept gardens. A set of soft cotton pajamas and a new toothbrush were laid out on the pillow. His quiet, thorough consideration was in every detail. "Sleep well, Ethan," he said from the doorway. "You too, Arthur," I replied, the name feeling both strange and right on my tongue. I lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the storm and the unfamiliar sounds of the old house. I thought about the touch of his hand, the warmth in his voice, the quiet, steady way he had inserted himself into my chaotic life and brought a measure of peace. I was falling. I wasn't sure what I was falling into, a friendship, a mentorship, something more, but the sensation was undeniable. It was terrifying, and it was wonderful. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of brilliant, polished blue and the fresh, earthy smell of rain-soaked soil. I woke feeling more rested than I had in years. When I went downstairs, the smell of coffee and bacon drew me to the kitchen. Arthur was standing at the stove, a spatula in hand, dressed in another soft sweater. "Morning," he said, glancing over his shoulder with a small smile. "I hope you like pancakes." We ate breakfast in a comfortable silence, the morning sun streaming through the kitchen windows. It felt so normal, so easy, that it was almost surreal. This man, this pillar of the community, was making me pancakes. After the way my life had been, the constant struggle and anxiety, this simple domestic act felt like the ultimate luxury. As I was getting ready to leave, he stopped me at the door. "Ethan," he said, his tone more serious than it had been all morning. "I need to go into the city for a few days. A board meeting for the museum. I'll be back on Friday." A ridiculous, childish pang of disappointment hit me. I had grown so accustomed to the quiet rhythm of our days that the thought of the library being empty felt wrong. "Oh, okay, I was wondering," he continued, his gaze steady. "If you would consider staying here while I'm gone." I stared at him, confused. "Staying here? Why?" "The house feels overly silent when it's completely empty," he said, a hint of vulnerability in his voice that I had never heard before. "And besides," he added, his tone becoming more practical, "it would save you the commute. You could work as late as you like. The gardens are lovely this time of year. You could take a break, walk around." He was offering me his home, the keys to his kingdom. The level of trust it implied was staggering. He was also, I realized, offering me a choice. He wasn't commanding me to stay. He was asking. He was making himself vulnerable, in his own quiet way. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I wouldn't have asked if I weren't," he replied simply. He held my gaze, and in his eyes, I saw a question that had nothing to do with house-sitting. He was asking for my trust. He was offering his in return. This is it. This is the moment where I can step back, retreat to the safety of my old, lonely life. Or I can step forward, into this strange, warm, and terrifying new world he is offering me. I take a breath. "I'd like that," I say. "Thank you." The relief that washed over his face was subtle, but I saw it. A slight softening around his eyes, a barely perceptible relaxation of his shoulders. It was as if he had been holding his breath, too. "Good," he said, his voice warm. "I'll have Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, prepare the room for you properly. Make yourself at home." And just like that, I was no longer a visitor. I was a guest, a resident. The distinction felt monumental. The 3 days Arthur was gone were the strangest of my life. I lived in his house, slept in his guest room, and worked in his library, but the soul of the place was missing. The silence was different. It was no longer a comfortable, shared quiet, but a hollow, waiting one. I found myself listening for the sound of his footsteps in the hall, for the low murmur of his voice on the phone. I followed his advice and explored the grounds. The gardens were a labyrinth of blooming flowers, ancient trees, and hidden stone benches. I found a small, glass-paned conservatory filled with exotic orchids, and I knew, with a pang in my chest, that this must have been Eleanor's special place. It was all beautiful, but my enjoyment of it was muted, like watching a film in black and white. The color, I realized, was Arthur. I worked diligently, pouring all my restless energy into the catalog. The project was a tangible link to him, a task he had entrusted me with. I was more than halfway finished, and the sense of accomplishment was satisfying, but it was overshadowed by a growing sense of anticipation for his return. I missed him. The realization was as simple and as shocking as a sudden clap of thunder on a clear day. I missed his quiet presence, his dry humor, his steady, calming influence. On Friday afternoon, I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. I was in the library, and my head snapped up, my heart giving a ridiculous leap. I went to the window and watched as he got out of his car. He looked tired, the lines on his face more pronounced. He stretched, rubbing the back of his neck, and then he looked up at the house, his eyes going directly to the library window where I stood. Our eyes met across the expanse of the lawn. He couldn't possibly have seen me clearly, but he raised his hand in a small, weary wave. I felt a jolt, a current of connection that was as real as any physical touch. I stepped back from the window, my heart hammering. He was home. When he came inside, he dropped his briefcase by the door with a heavy thud. "Long week," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Welcome home," I said, the words feeling surprisingly natural. He looked at me, and a slow smile spread across his tired face. "It's good to be home." He looked around, at the quiet order of the house. "Everything all right while I was away?" "Perfect," I said. "The house is still standing," he chuckled, the sound warm and welcome in the silent hall. "That's a relief. How is the project coming?" I finished the 19th century engravings, I told him, proud of the progress. I've started on the modern watercolors. Excellent, he said, but his focus seemed to be elsewhere. He was looking at me, his gaze intense. Ethan, there's something we need to discuss. My stomach dropped. Here it comes. The "this isn't working out" speech. The "let's return to a professional relationship" talk. I braced myself. Okay, not now, he said, shaking his head as if to clear it. I need a drink and a moment of quiet. But later, after dinner, the next few hours were a strange kind of torture. We moved around each other, preparing a simple meal of pasta, the air thick with unspoken things. The easy companionship of the week before was gone, replaced by a palpable tension. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was heavy, loaded. I replayed every moment of the past few weeks in my head, searching for the mistake I must have made, the line I had inadvertently crossed. Finally, after we had cleared the dishes, he led me not to the library, but to a small, cozy sitting room with a fireplace. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed one to me. He gestured for me to sit in one of the armchairs, and he took the other, a small table between us. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes closed for a moment. When he opened them, they were clear and very serious. When I was in the city, he began, his voice low, I had dinner with a member of the museum's board. A notorious gossip. I waited, my knuckles white on the glass. She saw you and me together, he continued. In town, a week or so ago. We were at the bookstore, remember? I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. I remembered the day. We had gone to pick up a reference book for the project and had ended up browsing for an hour, talking about novels we loved. It had been one of the best afternoons of my life. She made a comment. Arthur said, his jaw tight. An ugly, insinuating comment. About wealthy, older men and the company they keep. The air left my lungs. The shame from the gala felt like a distant memory compared to the hot, searing humiliation that washed over me now. It was my greatest fear, spoken aloud by a stranger. That people would look at us and see a transaction, a cliché. That they would see me as a commodity he had purchased. She asked me if you were my new project, Arthur said, his voice laced with a cold fury I had never heard before. I couldn't speak. I just stared into my glass, at the amber liquid, wishing I could disappear into it. I corrected her, he said, his voice softening as he looked at me. I told her you were my colleague. But the word felt insufficient. It felt like a lie. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze pinning me in place. Because the truth, Ethan, is that I haven't been able to think of you as just a colleague for a very long time. The world stopped. The ticking of the clock, the hum of the house, my own frantic heartbeat, it all went silent. I looked up at him, my mind reeling. This arrangement, he said, gesturing around the room, at the house, it started as a simple, good-faith offer of employment. I saw someone who was capable and in need of a better opportunity. But it has become something else. For me, at least, he paused, and the vulnerability I had seen in him before was back, tenfold. I am acutely aware of the differences between us. Our ages, our financial situations. I know how it looks to the outside world. And the last thing I ever want to do is put you in a position where you feel pressured, or obligated, or compromised. He took a deep breath. That is why I have to say this. I value your presence in my home, in my life, more than I can properly express. But I cannot continue this way, with this ambiguity. It's not fair to you. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. So, I am giving you a choice. You can finish the project, take the money, and we can part ways as friends, with my deepest gratitude and respect. Or he trailed off, searching for the words. Or, I prompted, my voice a broken whisper. Or we can admit that this is more than a job, he said, his voice raw with emotion. And we can try to figure out what it is, together, as equals. With no expectations and no obligations, he finally looked away, staring into the empty fireplace. I am an old man, Ethan. I am set in my ways. But I find that my ways are better, with you in them. It was a confession, a declaration. It was the most terrifying and beautiful thing I had ever heard. He had laid his heart bare, but he had also, once again, given me all the power. He had built me an exit, clear and well lit, and was promising not to stand in the way if I chose to take it. All my fear, all my insecurity, all the warnings I had given myself, they were all there. but they were drowned out by a single, overwhelming truth. This was real. His care, his respect, his affection, it was all real. And I wanted it. More than I had ever wanted anything. I set my glass down on the table with a soft click. I stood up, my legs trembling, and walked the few steps that separated our chairs. I knelt before him, just as he had knelt before me at the gala, all those weeks ago. I took his hands in mine. They were cold. "Arthur," I said, my voice finally steady. "There's nowhere else I want to be." He looked down at me, his eyes shining with an emotion I couldn't name. He brought one of my hands to his lips and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to my knuckles. "Ethan," he breathed, and my name was a prayer. He stood, pulling me up with him. He framed my face with his hands, his thumbs gently stroking my cheekbones. He was searching my eyes, looking for any hint of doubt or hesitation. He found none. "Is this okay?" he whispered, his voice thick. "Yes," I breathed. "It's more than okay." He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. I didn't. I met him halfway. His lips were soft, hesitant at first, a question. I answered by pressing back, a firm, unequivocal yes. The kiss was not frantic or desperate. It was like coming home. It was slow and deep and tasted of whiskey and relief. It was the closing of a door on a lonely past and the opening of a door to an unknown, but hopeful, future. When we finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine. We stood like that for a long time, just breathing each other in, the silence of the room now filled with a new, profound peace. "I was so afraid," he murmured against my skin. "Me too," I confessed. He pulled back just enough to look at me, a small, wondrous smile on his face. "Not anymore?" I smiled back, a real, unshadowed smile that reached my eyes. "No," I said, and I had never been more certain of anything in my life. Not anymore. The morning after felt like waking up in a new world. The light filtering through the guest room window seemed warmer, the birdsong outside brighter. I lay in bed, tracing the patterns on the ceiling, and replayed the kiss, the confession, the quiet hours of conversation that had followed, over and over in my mind. It felt both like a dream and like the most real thing that had ever happened to me. But with the clarity of morning came a small, creeping tendril of unease. The old anxieties, the ones I thought had been vanquished, stirred in their sleep. What now? What did this mean? The grand, sweeping romance of the late-night confession felt a world away from the practical, mundane questions of the morning. I was still a broke student. He was still a millionaire. I was sleeping in his guest room. I dressed and went downstairs, my footsteps hesitant on the grand staircase. I found Arthur in the kitchen, just as I had the last time, standing at the counter with his back to me, making coffee. The scene was so familiar, so domestic, yet everything had changed. "Morning," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He turned, a mug in his hand, and the smile he gave me was so full of warmth and unguarded affection that it chased away some of the morning shadows. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low, happy rumble. "Coffee, please," I said, taking a seat at the kitchen table. He brought 2 mugs over and sat down across from me. He didn't reach for my hand or make any grand gesture. He just sat, sipping his coffee, and looked at me. But the way he looked at me was different. The careful, respectful distance was gone, replaced by an open, tender intimacy that made my heart ache in the best possible way. "How did you sleep?" he asked. "Well," I said. "Very well," he nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Me too." He paused, his expression turning more serious. "Ethan, I want to talk about logistics." My heart sank a little. Logistics sounded cold, transactional. He must have seen the flicker of disappointment in my eyes, because he reached across the table and covered my hand with his. His touch was warm and reassuring. "No, not like that," he said gently. "I just mean, I want to do this right. I want you to feel secure and independent." He took a breath. "First, the project. You're nearly finished. I want you to finish it, and I am going to pay you the full amount we agreed upon. That is a business arrangement, and it will be honored. Your work has been exemplary, and you've earned it." I started to protest, to say that it felt wrong now, but he held up a hand. "This is not negotiable," he said, his tone firm but kind. "Your financial independence is important. It's important for you, and it's important for us. I will never be the man who uses money to create dependency. Do you understand?" I looked at him, at the fierce integrity in his eyes, and I felt a wave of love and gratitude so powerful it almost knocked me over. He wasn't just thinking about his own feelings. He was actively thinking about my well-being, my agency. He was protecting me, not just from the world, but from the potential pitfalls of our own relationship. I understand, I said, my voice thick. Good, he said, his hand squeezing mine gently. Second, he gestured around the kitchen, at the house. This is my home. For the last few weeks, it has been your workplace and your temporary residence. Now, I would very much like it if you would consider it your home, too. In whatever capacity you are comfortable with, he continued before I could even process the magnitude of what he was offering. I'm not asking you to move in tomorrow. I'm not asking you to give up your apartment or your life. I'm just saying, the door is open. The guest room is officially your room, for as long as you want it. There is a key for you on the hall table. Come and go as you please. Stay when you want. Go when you need to. No questions, no pressure. He was, piece by piece, dismantling the power imbalance between us. He was giving me a key, not a cage. He was offering me a choice, every single day. What do you think? He asked, his voice laced with a faint, boyish anxiety that was incredibly endearing. I brought his hand to my lips, mirroring the gesture he had made the night before. I think, I said, looking him in the eye, that you are the kindest man I have ever met. The weeks that followed were a quiet, happy blur. I finished the cataloging project, and Arthur, true to his word, transferred the full amount to my bank account. The relief of seeing that number, of knowing my rent was covered for the next year, was immense. But it was secondary to the relief of knowing I could now be with him without the specter of employment hanging over us. I didn't give up my apartment, but I spent more and more nights at Greywood. We fell into a new rhythm, one that was no longer based on work, but on shared living. We cooked dinner together, our bodies moving in a comfortable dance in his kitchen. We took long walks in the gardens after dinner, our hands clasped together. We sat in the library and read, sometimes for hours without speaking, the simple fact of his presence in the chair across from me a deep and abiding comfort. He showed me his world, not the flashy, gala-attending part of it, but the real part. He took me to the museum after hours, and we walked through the empty, silent galleries, his hand a warm presence on the small of my back. He told me the stories behind the paintings, his voice filled with passion and knowledge. He introduced me to his friends, a small, tight-knit group of academics and artists, who treated me not as Arthur's young friend, but as a person in my own right. And I, in turn, shared my world with him. It was a smaller, scrappier world, but he entered it with a gentle, non-judgmental curiosity. He came to my tiny, cluttered apartment and didn't bat an eye. He ate pizza off paper plates while sitting on my lumpy sofa and declared it the best meal he'd had in weeks. He came to my student art show, where I had a small photography exhibit, and he stood in front of my photos for a long time, his expression thoughtful and proud. One evening, we were sitting on the terrace, watching the sun set, a blanket shared over our laps. The air was cool, and the sky was streaked with pink and gold. Do you ever worry? I asked, my voice quiet. About what people think. He was silent for a moment, and I felt a flicker of fear. He turned to look at me, his face softened by the twilight. I spent the first 55 years of my life worrying about what people think, he said, his voice a low rumble. I built a company, I upheld a family name, I did what was expected of me. And I was content. But I wasn't happy. He reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear, his touch feather-light. Since you fell into my life, quite literally, he said, a smile in his voice, I have been happy. Truly happy. The opinions of gossiping board members seem remarkably insignificant in comparison. He leaned in and kissed me, a slow, gentle kiss that was full of promise. Let them talk, he murmured against my lips. All that matters is what happens here, between us, and I knew he was right. Our relationship wasn't built for public consumption. It was built in the quiet moments, in the shared silence of the library, in the warmth of a coffee mug on a cold morning, in the steady, reassuring pressure of his hand in mine. It was a quiet foundation, settling into place, strong and sure. The differences between us hadn't vanished. He was still wealthy, and I was still a student. He had a lifetime of experience behind him, and mine was just beginning. But those differences were no longer a chasm. They were simply Context. They were part of the texture of our story, not the whole narrative. The narrative was about care. It was about respect. It was about two lonely people who found a home in each other. One Saturday morning, I woke up in his bed, not the guest room bed, but his bed, with the sun on my face and the solid weight of his arm around my waist. He was still asleep, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm against my back. I lay there for a long time, just feeling the simple, profound peace of the moment. This was what it felt like. Not to be rescued, but to be seen. Not to be carried, but to be met. I thought back to the night of the gala, to the boy on the floor, surrounded by shattered pieces of his life. I wished I could tell him that it was all going to be okay, that the worst moment of his life was about to lead him to the very best. Arthur stirred behind me, his arm tightening around me. "You're awake," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "I'm awake," I said, turning in his arms to face him. I looked at his kind, familiar face, the sleep lines crinkling the corners of his eyes, and my heart felt so full I thought it might burst. He smiled, a slow, sleepy smile that was just for me. "Good," he said, and he pulled me closer, burying his face in my neck. "Stay," and I knew I would. This quiet place, this steady warmth, this patient love, it was the home I had been searching for all my life. I had found it in the most unexpected of places, with the most unexpected of men, and I was never letting go. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you? If the story resonated, a like helps others find it. Subscribe for more slow burn male/male love stories told with warmth and care.